Today, the original plan was to talk about Skeleton Magi and how I would aim to fix them as part of a potential patch 2.5, though I realized that would be a little self-indulgent. So instead, we'll have a primer on summons, so by the end of this, you'll know how they work and how to exploit them properly. The reason we're looking at this is because previously there were questions every now and then about it, but a somewhat recent video from another creator has made the question of Skeleton Magi specifically pop up a lot more frequently because it's commonly known I am a Necromancer main. The reality is, the balance of the Skeleton Magi against other skills and even summons is actually pretty difficult to pin down just right, and as it stands, the Magi are under-tweaked, but they are far from sucking in 2.4. Generally speaking, the Magi have had a bad reputation for ages, not really because of how mediocre they are, and they are mediocre, but because most people don't actually invest in knowing the mechanics of summoners beyond the very basic concept of either a Fishy-mancer with Corpse Explosion and amp damage, or the lazy Zoo-mancer with just a ton of minions and bigger number themed auras just idling their way through farming, usually with Decrepify or amp damage. The reality is, while a properly set up Zoomancer is pretty relaxing to play, most people don't understand combat mechanics, much less minion mechanics, enough to take full advantage of the minions at their different stages of development, and as such, don't realize that mages have a role throughout most of the game of a summoner, and it's just that the role changes depending on your equipment and your goals. At the low end, they're actually what most people expect, cannon fodder that adds to your damage pool, which basically means while you're in normal or even early Nightmare with crap equipment on your solo Self-Found run, they're mostly going to be around for chip damage, and to serve as Thorns fodder, or in the case of Poison and Cold Magi, just to apply their status effects as needed, so Poison to prevent healing and Cold to chill enemies. Not really worth investing extra points in, because at these levels it's much easier to just focus on boosting the warriors, but you can do enough with just 1 point in the skeleton mages and use plus skills for utility. This is mostly because gaining levels in skeleton mastery as part of boosting your warriors and revives also conveniently boosts your mages as well, giving them 1 missile level for every point in mastery, with missile levels being the determining factor as to how much damage they do, while Magi themselves only gain 1 missile level every other level in Skeletal Mage, starting at level 4. And since you don't need too many applications of mage effects, getting the missiles up and going is more important than getting your mage count up early on. At the higher end though, mages work a little bit different, as do other summons, because you have access to a number of things that can influence how they perform, most of which are auras, with curses merely providing support for them. So let's start off with the most misunderstood, and funnily enough the biggest nerf of patch 2.4. Damage Reflection, or more precisely Thorns and Spirit of Barbs. Now, while I still say that these skills are overall better now for general use, they are actually severely nerfed for this use case due to being changed from percent damage to fixed damage. The reason being, summons take 4 times damage, and mercenaries take 2 times damage from bosses, and the return damage is based on actual damage in 2.3 rather than anticipated damage. With 2.4, this is restricted to Iron Maiden, which makes it less useful since you cannot have Amplify damage and Iron Maiden up at the same time, making the strategy less useful later. But it is still why you'll often hear me recommending Clay Golem plus Iron Maiden for boss kills in normal. It's just so much faster than the Decrepify route, and I don't see this changing with 2.4. Whereas in Nightmare in Hell, you should have your summons up to a strong enough level to take advantage of the Decrepify trick or even Amplify damage. Next is the Fanaticism discussion, one that I've gotten into several times. This is a weird one because it can get a little complicated, but the simplified version is that every minion that can get Fanaticism and can attack, yes, even Skeleton Magi missiles are considered attacks, benefit from Fanaticism. That said, it can only impact any of them so much. This is because there is a 3/5 of a second or 15 frame AI delay built into the minion attacks that is unaffected by it, but the actual attack frames for minions can be shortened. For example, with no Fanaticism, Magi are on a 33 frame attack cycle, or about 1 1/3 seconds. With level 11 or higher Fanaticism though, they drop to a 28 frame attack cycle, which is only a mouse fart above 1 second. Which can add up, especially whenever you're consistently fighting through an area and they're having to recharge between different packs of enemies. The other advantage of Fanaticism is that it does benefit your non-Magi minions as well by boosting their raw damage and attack rating, that last one being important for our next point. And that is Infinity versus Pride for post-game gear. The reality is Pride on the Necromancer is only good for 2 specific subsets of the Summoner, and the Druid generally only has 1 subset that is preferred for. while Infinity is almost universally better for both. And this is not just for Magi or elemental druids that use summons. This is actually because Infinity has a serious effect not only on enemy resists, but also their defense. And outside of the Druid Grizzly and Skeleton Magi, attack rating and defense can play an important role in how effective your army is because of their naturally mediocre attack rating. This is also why Infinity is the turning point between most people using Decrepify for their armies and when they start using Amplified damage consistently. It's also worth noting Infinity, not lower resist, is also the turning point between people using mages offensively and using them as support tools. Speaking of lower resist, there is also the discussion of what curses you should be using as a summoning necromancer. The reality is, it depends on how far along you are and what your army composition is. Though for most variants, the most used curse should be amplified damage, with exceptions for bosses depending on your mercenary gear, difficulty, and minions. For normal, you want to use Iron Maiden against the bosses with a clay golem. It will just be easier to chug mana and throw Clayboy in front to get smacked around and return the massive damage as a percent because every boss has a physical attack. In Nightmare in Hell, if you're using weaker gear, you should be running Decrepify and Clay Golem, throw the Clay Golem out in front to get hit and apply his slow first, and then use the Decrepify, and you should probably be using a Might Mercenary to boost up your skeleton so it'll at least not take half an hour. Unfortunately, the budget alternative to boost hit chance in the Act 1 Mercenary is not as consistent, and you lose out on a lot of your offensive buffs, and the upcoming Act 5 Mercenary change with Battle Cry will override your curses. That said, once you get Infinity though, you should switch back to Amplify damage against bosses, since your damage by then will be high enough to punish them before they can even get close to hurting your army. There is, however, one curse exception that I was on the fence about mentioning, and I'm adding this kind of like later on, and that is for Fishymancers specifically. In most areas, they should use Amplify damage too. However, when dealing with large packs of physical immunes, like ghosts or the handful of physical immune succubi, you should actually be using lower resist for your corpse explosion. This is because Amplify damage will only, at most, let 20% of the physical damage through, where lower resist will reduce the fire resistances much further unless they're dual immune. Last on the summoner plate is the topic of teleport. I recommend shopping a teleport staff as soon as possible for any summoner build and aiming for an enigma if you can, but teleport is more of a tool than something you need to be using consistently. I mainly reserve mine for boss fights and for tight corridors when doing solo self-found, for example, because I do shop a teleport staff for that, letting my minions and spells just handle the rest of the enemies in time. A lot of people think that Enigma is a necessity to do things with a summoner, and the reality is that's blatantly false. The only time I feel the absolute need to teleport is in areas like Maggot Lair and the Act 3 sewers. Everywhere else it's just a convenience to save a couple seconds or even like half a second at times in places like cows. The reality is, summoners are a fairly misunderstood build that could use some tweaking here and there, but more so on the druid than the necromancer. That said, I did originally set out to give recommendations on how to fix the skeleton magi without turning them into overpowered beasts or doing something like stripping them of their identity and making them archers. For this, I would go with one of two paths. The first being to make Summon Resist a synergy for Skeleton Magi and Fire Golems, boosting their elemental damage based on points invested in the skill. This would allow a natural bump to their damage output if you wanted to focus on these without aiding their other summon counterparts. A similar thing could be done with Lower Resist and going a Piercing synergy instead, but I feel the amplification at the base would allow for more interesting builds. The alternative path would be to continue to feed the current synergy pool. This would mean linking Raised Skeletal Mage, Raised Skeleton, and maybe even Revive, much like the Druid summons are interlinked, basically allowing you to choose how to augment your summons based on how you invest of each of these in addition to the current base Skeleton Mastery. A setup allowing Raised Skeleton to boost the damage output of Magi and Revives, Raised Skeletal Mage boosting the attack rating of Warriors and Revives, and Revive further boosting the life of the Warriors and the Magi would probably work out pretty well. Obviously, this would require a bit more balance testing, but would allow for more familiar skill layouts and not change the playstyle of the build significantly. And while I think some of the more extreme ideas are interesting, things like Skeleton Archers or Mages casting Charge Bolt, Chain Lightning, or proper Fireballs have always felt more in the realm of mods than the core game, since they not only change the power level of the build, but also drastically change the flavor of the builds as well.